go back to the beginning. You said both of you were going, not going out, but just having other relationships, and then there's a defining moment in Sunday 8 where you went to see Les, and then after that, did the whole relationship change from, where I would call an open relationship to more monogamous, committed?
Not immediately. I was still on the road. I was traveling probably at least half the year. I mean, not that I would be gone 6 months and home 6 months, but rather I'd be out for 8 or 10 weeks and back for half dozen weeks and then out again. And by this time we were living in New York, and we were young and foolish, but we weren't fools, I don't think. Neither of us expected that the other one was had 100% fidelity in the process. But I can remember now that I'm thinking about it, there were conversations at times where we would talk about people we had met. The assumption was that there had been some kind of liaison, but there were certain unwritten rules, and there were certain times when you would see someone or you would talk about it and you would say, not him. That there would be certain people who were off what's the term?
We're too threatening.
Yes, we're too threatening. They were off limits.
Yeah.
You weren't allowed to. You weren't allowed. You could be friends with, but not have a relationship with that person.
I think the first 5 years of living in New York, besides New York being, a wilder, more difficult place to settle, and just the challenges of creating a new life in a new place. I was starting a new career. He was had many challenges in his career,
But also at that age, it's like a candy shop. I mean, you're in New York, and everything and anything and everyone and anyone that you've ever thought about, lusted after, or dreamt about is on the street. I mean, it's all there. So it's hard to imagine. It was not natural for us to immediately say, okay, here are the rules, and this is going to. It just didn't occur to us at the time to shut it down. It really was the epidemic that really pushed us into monogamy.
I think that's true. Well, in older age, I think pushed us into monogamy. But we defined rules as some spoken, some unspoken, as we recommitted to our relationship. As I said, the first 5 years were, I think, the most challenging. We had to try to figure out how we could love each other and prove to each other that we were the most important part of each other's lives.
And yet we were still struggling with, at that time, there was a real struggle as a gay couple to define ourselves away from heterosexual couples. We were really trying not to be our parents, and it was. I remember a book came out about male couples at the time, and it was like we read that thing from cover to cover. The thought that there were male couples who'd been together for 35 years in 1979, 80 just blew us away. I mean, it was like, oh my God, there are people out here who are really doing this.
Right.
And so in some ways, it was the first indication to us that you didn't have to just think in terms of tomorrow or next week, but you could think about life together. But there were no rules for us to follow in that sense.
Right. So we were creating our own rules to work at the relationship, and yet I think some of the traditional values that we grew up with, not necessarily the first of them being monogamy, but or fidelity, but a way of being together and considering that we were together for life. Although we may never have really talked about it much until recently, it was clear to me that my commitment, if I could make it work, was forever.
I think that part of the struggle early on was we were still developing, we were still young enough to try to decide who we were. So I can remember having conversations about trying to find ways for us each to do the things we wanted to do without stepping on each other. And I think we have said to other couples on occasion, both straight and gay couples, one of the problems that you run into is just the other ego. And with two men, there's all this testosterone blowing around. So you've got that, and then people get on a high horse about how that's going to work out. So there were some discussions. There was a constant, at least on my part, an awareness of, was this going to push you too far, whatever it was. And I can remember at times, when you would say, challenge back that something was, it was too much, or it was, overbearing, or whatever it was. And I was totally, whatever it was something I was totally unaware of. Mm-hmm. So that sometimes we were pushing buttons that we didn't even know existed. And that still takes time, years, to get a sense of that. But there was always a sense of trying to kind of just work for tomorrow, and how do we keep going? How does this go without hurting each other in the most extreme case? And in the best case, how do we keep moving ahead and making it better for us as we go?
Yeah. Trying to define how we could each have our own lives and still have lives together in the first 5 to 10 years was the real challenge. I want to have my own career, I want to be my own person, I want a sense of self, and yet he was very successful, making more money than I was, in a world that was more glamorous, so I felt threatened that somehow he was more important than I was. And that just took work. Les has a big ego, but he's also humble enough to allow me my space. And sometimes I would fight for my space, and sometimes he would fight for his. And so it was a challenge. It just took me a while to feel solid as a person in my career, and feeling like I was doing something successfully enough that I could feel his equal. But I needed to be his equal, and there were times when that was hard, I think.